Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The small town of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with its rolling hills and Amish countryside, holds a secret that remained buried for decades. In July of 1958, the Martinez family, Manuel, a 34-year-old accountant from Philadelphia, his wife Eleanor, 32, and her elderly mother Constance, moved into the old Victorian house on Willow Creek Road. The three-story structure stood at the edge of town, partially obscured by ancient oak trees, a 15-minute drive from the town square. County records indicate the home had been empty for 7 years prior to their arrival. The realtor who sold them the property, a man identified in local records only as Mr. Harper, reportedly offered the house at a price significantly below market value. According to statements later collected by a local journalist, Harper had been unusually eager to complete the sale, insisting on a cash transaction with minimal paperwork. When asked years later about the sale, Harper claimed to have no memory of the Martinez family or the Willow Creek property. The first unusual occurrence happened 3 days after the family moved in. While arranging furniture in what would become Manuel's home office, Eleanor noticed a thin crack running along the ceiling, not unusual in a house built in the late 1800s. But when she pressed against it with a broom handle, a small section of the ceiling gave way, revealing a narrow wooden ladder leading upward. None of the house plans or property documents mentioned a third-floor attic space. According to Eleanor's journal, found years later by distant relatives, she initially called for Manuel to investigate, but curiosity drove her to climb the ladder herself while he was out purchasing supplies. The journal entry from July 16, 1958 reads, "The space is larger than expected. Dusty beams, smells of mothballs and something else. Found several crates. One contains portraits, beautiful frames. Will show Manuel tonight." What Eleanor failed to mention in that entry, but would later describe to a neighbor, was the unsettling nature of those portraits. According to this neighbor's testimony to the local newspaper in 1962, Eleanor had confided that every single pair of eyes in the paintings had been meticulously scratched out with what appeared to be a sharp instrument. The collection consisted of 23 portraits, dating from the late 1800s to the early 1930s, based on clothing styles and photographic techniques. Some were professional photographs in ornate frames, others were amateur paintings on canvas. A few appeared to be family groupings, while most depicted single individuals, men, women, all adults of various ages. They shared no obvious physical trait suggesting family relation, but one detail unified them all. Where eyes should have been, there were only rough scratches that penetrated the surface of each image. A small brass plaque was affixed to the back of each frame, bearing only a date, no names, no locations. The earliest date was 1873, the most recent, 1931. Manuel, according to multiple accounts from neighbors and colleagues, insisted the portraits be removed from the house immediately. Eleanor's journal confirms this. "Make wants them gone, says they're morbid. Mother agrees. But something about them feels important, historic. I've stored them in the garden shed for now." In the weeks that followed, the family settled into a routine. Manuel commuted to his accounting job at a manufacturing plant 20 miles away in York. Eleanor, who had previously worked as a primary school teacher, took a position at the Lancaster Public Library in the records department. Her mother, Constance, who had been widowed during the Second World War, maintained the household. Neighbors described the Martinez family as quiet but pleasant. They attended the local Presbyterian church occasionally, though never became regular members. Manuel was remembered as formal but cordial, Eleanor as bright and curious, while Constance was rarely seen beyond the property boundaries. The family kept to themselves, but wasn't considered unusual by local standards. The first significant change noted by neighbors came in early September, approximately 6 weeks after the discovery of the portraits. The delivery man from the local pharmacy, who regularly brought medication for Constance's arthritis, reported that Eleanor had developed a strange habit of staring intensely at him without blinking. When he mentioned this to his supervisor, the pharmacy owner dismissed it, suggesting the delivery man had an overactive imagination. By mid-September, Eleanor's journal entries began to show a preoccupation with the portraits she had relocated to the garden shed. An entry dated September 20th reads, "Went to check on the collection today. The smell is stronger now, like soil after heavy rain. Found myself studying the scratch marks again, each one unique, not random. Deliberate, almost like a signature." Eleanor's mother, according to a handwritten note found among Constance's personal effects after her death, became concerned about her daughter's behavior around this time. The note, undated but presumed to be from early autumn 1958, states, "E spending too much time in the shed, comes back with dust on her clothes, speaks of research but won't explain. M works late. Doesn't notice." On October 3, 1958, Eleanor took a sudden leave of absence from her library position, citing family matters. Her supervisor noted in the employment record that Eleanor had seemed distracted and tired in the days leading up to her departure. What the record doesn't mention, but what a co-worker later revealed to a reporter, was that Eleanor had been caught removing historical records from the library archives, specifically documents relating to the history of their house on Willow Creek Road and its previous occupants. These removed records were never recovered. What information Eleanor might have discovered remains unknown. By late October, the Martinez family had begun to withdraw from community life entirely. Manuel stopped attending the weekly poker game he had joined at a colleague's house. Eleanor no longer answered the telephone. Grocery deliveries were left on the front porch with payment tucked under the doormat. The only family member occasionally seen was Constance, who would sit on the front porch in the mornings, wrapped in a heavy blanket regardless of the temperature, staring toward the road. The postal worker who delivered mail to the house during this period later told investigators that the curtains were always drawn, and on the few occasions when Manuel answered the door to sign for packages, he avoided eye contact and seemed to squint, as if unaccustomed to daylight. On November 12, 1958, a Thursday, Eleanor's journal contains its final entry. "They're watching, not just from the frames, from everywhere. M doesn't understand yet. Mother knows something but won't speak of it. Found the key today. Small brass thing, hidden in the backing of the oldest portrait. It must open something here. The scratches are a map." That same evening, according to police records, Manuel Martinez placed a call to the local doctor, requesting an immediate house visit. The physician, Dr. Thomas Weaver, arrived at approximately 8:30 in the evening. His medical notes, which became part of the subsequent investigation, state only that he prescribed a sedative for Eleanor, who was described as agitated and suffering from apparent delusions. Dr. Weaver recommended psychiatric evaluation, but noted that Manuel declined, stating they would handle matters privately. 3 days later, on Sunday, November 15th, smoke was seen rising from the garden shed at the Martinez property. A neighbor, Vernon Miller, whose property adjoined the eastern boundary, reported that he had gone to investigate and found Manuel burning what appeared to be canvases and photographic paper in a metal trash can. According to Miller's statement, Manuel was methodical, almost ceremonial, in the burning, placing each item individually into the flames and watching it burn completely before adding the next. When Miller asked about the fire, Manuel reportedly said only, "Family business." Best forgotten. Miller noted that Manuel's eyes were bloodshot and his hands trembled. The following week brought the first major snowfall of the season. The Martinez house, normally kept in meticulous condition, remained unshoveled. Mail accumulated in the box. Concerned neighbors contacted Manuel's workplace, only to learn he had taken an indefinite leave of absence starting November 18th. On December 1st, 1958, the Lancaster Police Department received a call from Constance Bell, Eleanor's mother. According to the police report filed that day, the elderly woman reported that her daughter and son-in-law were not themselves and that she feared for her safety. The responding officer, Patrolman James Harding, visited the property but found no evidence of immediate danger. His report states, "Residence in unusual condition, untidy. Occupants appeared disheveled but coherent. Mr. Martinez explained they were all suffering from seasonal influenza. Mrs. Martinez, not present during visit, reported to be resting upstairs. Mrs. Bell seemed confused when questioned further, retracted concerns." Harding noted that the interior of the house was dark, with sheets and blankets covering many of the windows. He also observed that several mirrors had been turned to face the walls or covered with cloth. When asked about this, Manuel explained it was an old family remedy for illness, to rest the eyes. 2 weeks passed without further incident. Then, on December 16th, a Tuesday, Eleanor Martinez appeared at the Lancaster Library, asking to speak with the head archivist. According to witness statements, she appeared thin and pale, with unwashed hair, and wearing clothes unsuitable for the winter weather. The archivist, Dr. Helen Simmons, agreed to meet with her former employee. Their conversation took place in a private office and lasted approximately 40 minutes. Dr. Simmons later reported that Eleanor had inquired about local history, specifically if there were any records of ritual practices or protective measures against observation in Lancaster County's early history. Dr. Simmons directed her to standard historical texts, but noted Eleanor seemed dissatisfied with these suggestions. Before leaving, Eleanor reportedly placed a small package on Dr. Simmons's desk, saying, "For safekeeping, don't open it unless something happens." Dr. Simmons, concerned but uncertain how to respond, accepted the package and placed it in her desk drawer. 3 days later, on Friday, December 19th, smoke was again seen rising from the Martinez property, this time from the main house. By the time the fire department arrived, flames had engulfed the entire 3rd floor. Manuel and Eleanor were found in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor, unconscious from smoke inhalation. Constance was discovered in the kitchen, apparently having attempted to leave the house. All 3 family members were transported to Lancaster General Hospital. Constance Bell died en route. Manuel Martinez regained consciousness briefly that evening, but suffered cardiac arrest in the early hours of December 20th and could not be resuscitated. Eleanor survived but remained unresponsive. Fire investigators determined that the blaze had originated in the attic space. Among the charred remains, they discovered an unusual arrangement of items. 23 empty picture frames arranged in a circle on the floor surrounding a single wooden chair. Each frame contained only ash, the portraits themselves apparently destroyed before the fire. Scattered among the frames were small brass plaques, presumably the ones that had been attached to the backs of the portraits. The investigation revealed no clear cause for the fire. Faulty wiring was suggested as the most likely explanation, though the investigators' report noted the peculiar circumstances of the scene in the attic. Eleanor Martinez remained at Lancaster General Hospital for 4 months, diagnosed with severe catatonia. Medical records indicate she never spoke again. The attending physician, Dr. Robert Carver, noted that her only consistent behavior was a tendency to scratch or gouge at reflective surfaces, windows, metal trays, even the polished buttons on hospital staff uniforms. In April of 1959, Eleanor was transferred to Western State Psychiatric Hospital in Pittsburgh. Hospital admission records describe her as non-responsive to stimuli, with episodes of self-directed violence when presented with reflective surfaces. She remained there until her death from pneumonia in January of 1964, having never recovered sufficiently to provide any account of the events at the Willow Creek house. The property remained abandoned for nearly 2 years after the fire, the upper floor open to the elements, the lower portions sealed by county authorities. According to land records, the Martinez family's nearest relative, Manuel's brother, Anthony Martinez of Newark, New Jersey, inherited the property but expressed no interest in claiming or selling it, stating in a notarized letter that he wanted nothing to do with that cursed place. In March of 1961, Dr. Helen Simmons, the library archivist who had spoken with Eleanor shortly before the fire, finally opened the package entrusted to her. Her personal diary, discovered after her retirement in 1979, describes the contents. A small brass key, tarnished with age. Wrapped in a piece of paper containing a single sentence, "They watched them and were watched in return." Simmons reportedly took the key to the abandoned Martinez house, accompanied by a colleague from the library. They found the front door secured by county authorities, but the back entrance had been damaged by weather and was accessible. Their exploration of the fire-damaged house revealed little beyond water damage and decay, until Simmons discovered a small, previously overlooked lockbox in what had been Manuel's home office, concealed beneath damaged floorboards. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside was a journal, not Eleanor's personal diary, which had been recovered after the fire, but a different volume, older and bound in faded leather. Colson's journal chronicled his growing obsession with what he called the persistence of sight. Early entries described conventional photographic techniques of the era, but by 1871 his writings became increasingly focused on his theory that the human eye records and retains all it witnesses even after death. Most disturbing were Colson's descriptions of experiments he conducted, attempting to capture this preserved vision from recently deceased individuals by photographing their eyes within hours of death. The journal contained entries dating from 1869 to 1873, written by Jeremiah Colson, who identified himself as a portrait photographer with a studio in downtown Lancaster. He claimed varying levels of success, insisting that certain images developed from these sessions contained impressions of what the departed last beheld. The final entries from early 1873 described Colson's growing paranoia. He wrote of feeling watched whenever he developed these death portraits, sensing what he called returning gazes from the images. His last coherent entry, dated April 19, 1873, reads, "They look back now, from every plate, every print. The scratching doesn't stop them, only hides them from casual observation. They remain, watching, waiting. I have sealed the collection in the walls. May God forgive me." Historical records confirm that Jeremiah Colson died in June of 1873, reportedly from self-inflicted injuries. His photographic studio was sold, his equipment auctioned, and his personal effects disposed of. There is no mention in any public record of a collection of portraits. Dr. Simmons and her colleague brought the journal to the attention of the County Historical Society, where it was briefly examined before being archived. Her diary indicates that both she and her colleague experienced unsettling dreams after reading the journal, and they agreed not to pursue the matter further. The Martinez house on Willow Creek Road was finally demolished in the spring of 1962. During the demolition process, workers discovered a previously unknown space between the walls of the first and second floors, a narrow vertical chamber sealed with bricks that appeared much older than the surrounding structure. Inside they found only dust and a few scraps of deteriorated photographic paper, too damaged to reveal any images. The property remained vacant until 1967, when a developer purchased the land and constructed a modern ranch-style home on the foundation of the old house. The new structure was completed in early 1968 and sold to the Wilson family, who reported no unusual occurrences during their residence there. However, during renovations to the property in April of 1969, contractors uncovered something unusual beneath the concrete floor of the basement, a small metal box containing 23 brass plaques, each bearing only a date. The Wilson family, unaware of the property's history, donated these items to the Lancaster Historical Society, where they were cataloged and stored. In October of 1969, the Wilson family reported that one of the homeowners had begun to complain of nightmares involving people without eyes who stood in the corners of the bedroom at night. The family physician diagnosed night terrors and recommended a night light, which seemed to resolve the issue. What connects these disparate events? What happened to the Martinez family during their brief residence at the Willow Creek house? The most comprehensive theory comes from amateur historian Richard Graves, who spent 3 years researching the case in the late 1970s. According to Graves's unpublished manuscript, found among his personal papers after his death in 1986, the portraits discovered by Eleanor Martinez were likely Jeremiah Colson's infamous death portraits, photographs taken of the deceased, with a particular focus on capturing the eyes. Colson, believing these images contained the final visions of the dying, had hidden his collection when he became convinced that something in the photographs was looking back at him. Graves theorized that subsequent occupants of the house, which had indeed been built on the site of Colson's former home, had discovered the portraits over the decades, added to the collection with their own similar works, and ultimately suffered similar fates to Colson. The dates on the brass plaques, he suggested, corresponded not to when the portraits were created, but to when each owner of the collection died or disappeared. If Graves is correct, then the Martinez family was simply the latest in a series of victims, drawn into a cycle that began with Jeremiah Colson's macabre experiments nearly a century earlier. The scratched-out eyes were not acts of vandalism, but desperate attempts to stop whatever phenomenon the previous owners had experienced, the sensation of being watched by the dead, or something that used the portraits as windows. Eleanor's journal entries, with their references to watching and scratches as a map, suggest she may have uncovered this history during her research at the library. The missing historical records, those she allegedly removed from the archives, might have contained information connecting the house to Colson and the subsequent chain of ownership. What remains unclear is why Eleanor moved the portraits from the garden shed back to the attic, arranging them in the circular pattern found after the fire. Graves' manuscript offers a disturbing possibility that Eleanor, having discovered Colson's journal or similar records, attempted to reverse whatever process had been initiated, believing that the proper arrangement of the portraits might end the cycle. If such was her intent, the evidence suggests she failed. The fire, whatever its true cause, consumed the portraits but not their frames, as if the images themselves had combusted independently. And the discovery of the brass plaques in the basement years later, apparently hidden after the fire and before the demolition, raises the question, by whom? The Martinez family was already gone by then, with Manuel and Constance dead, and Eleanor institutionalized. In his final notes on the case, Graves wrote, "The most unsettling aspect is not what happened to the Martinez family, but what might have escaped from the portraits before they were destroyed. 23 pairs of eyes, scratched out but perhaps still seeing, released from their frames, and now without anchor or constraint." Graves abandoned his research shortly after writing these words. His personal diary entries from this period describe increasing insomnia and a growing aversion to mirrors and photographs. In his last entry, dated December 12, 1979, he wrote, "I understand now why Eleanor scratched at reflective surfaces. It's not to damage them. It's to test them, to see if what's looking back is really you." Richard Graves was found dead in his home on December 15, 1979, 3 days after that final entry. The coroner determined the cause of death to be heart failure. According to the police report, every reflective surface in his home, mirrors, television screen, even the glass of picture frames, had been covered with cloth or paper. Among the items in his study was a portrait of himself that he had commissioned the previous month. The eyes had been scratched out. The Wilson family continued to live in the house on Willow Creek Road until 1975, when they relocated to California for employment reasons. Subsequent owners reported no unusual experiences. The land has been redeveloped multiple times in the decades since, currently hosting a small apartment complex. The 23 brass plaques remain in the collection of the Lancaster Historical Society, cataloged as Artifacts of Unknown Provenance, circa 1900s. Dr. Helen Simmons lived until 1983, spending her retirement years traveling and writing a well-regarded history of Lancaster County that made no mention of the Martinez family or Jeremiah Colson. Her colleague who accompanied her to the abandoned house reportedly suffered a mental breakdown in 1964 and spent the remainder of her life in an assisted living facility, refusing to have photographs taken or to look into mirrors. In 1967, a routine inventory of patients' belongings at Western State Psychiatric Hospital discovered something unusual among Eleanor Martinez's personal effects, which had been stored since her death 3 years earlier. A small notebook previously overlooked contained no writing, only page after page of crude drawings. Each page showed the same image, a rectangular frame containing a face with the eyes scratched out. On the final page, however, the pattern was broken. The drawing showed a face with intact eyes, staring directly outward. Below it, in handwriting identified as Eleanor's, was written a single sentence: "The eyes are the windows. Breaking the glass doesn't close the window." The notebook was filed with Eleanor's medical records and eventually archived. Its current location is unknown. In the autumn of 1969, shortly before the Wilson family member began experiencing nightmares, Mrs. Wilson reported finding unusual markings on their family photographs. Someone had systematically scratched out the eyes in each image with a pin. When asked about this strange occurrence, there was only a cryptic response: "So they can't find their way back." The most recent documented connection to the case comes from 1970, when a graduate student researching early photographic techniques at the Lancaster Historical Society requested access to all materials related to Jeremiah Colson. According to staff records, the student spent several hours reviewing the available documents, including the journal found by Dr. Simmons. The student's research notes, which he left behind when he departed suddenly, contain repeated references to the persistence of sight and returning gazes, phrases taken directly from Colson's writings. The student never returned to complete his research. University records indicate he dropped out of his program shortly afterward, citing personal reasons. His current whereabouts are unknown. What truly happened to the Martinez family in that house on Willow Creek Road? Was Eleanor's deteriorating mental state simply a case of psychiatric illness, perhaps triggered by the unsettling discovery in the attic? Were Manuel's actions, burning the portraits, covering reflective surfaces, attempts to manage his wife's condition, or evidence that he too had begun to experience the phenomena she described? And what of Constance Bell, Eleanor's mother, who called the police expressing fear but then retracted her concerns? Her presence in the narrative is often overlooked, yet she was the only one who sought outside help. What did she observe in that house during those final weeks that prompted her call? The most enduring question remains: what was the nature of the portraits themselves? If we accept Jeremiah Colson's journal as factual rather than the writings of a disturbed mind, then the original collection consisted of photographs taken of the recently deceased, focusing on their eyes, which Colson believed retained impressions of their final visions. But the collection found by Eleanor included portraits spanning decades, well beyond Colson's lifetime. Who continued his work and why? Richard Graves's theory that subsequent owners added to the collection suggests a compulsion passed from one custodian to the next. Yet this fails to explain why each portrait had the eyes scratched out, an act that seems defensive rather than preservative. Were the scratches, as Eleanor's journal suggested, a kind of map? Or were they, as Graves came to believe, futile attempts to stop whatever process had been set in motion? Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that the portraits themselves were merely catalysts, physical anchors for something that used human perception as a doorway. The consistent theme across all accounts is the sensation of being watched, of gazes returned, of vision as a two-way channel rather than a passive sense. In this interpretation, the scratched-out eyes were not the source of the phenomenon, but attempts to block it, attempts that ultimately failed because, as Eleanor wrote in her hidden notebook, breaking the glass doesn't close the window. What little physical evidence remains of the case presents more questions than answers. The brass plaques, with their unexplained dates, the fragments of photographic paper found in the sealed wall cavity, the curious fact that the portrait frames survived the fire relatively intact, while their contents were completely consumed. The brass key that Eleanor entrusted to Dr. Simmons, which opened a lockbox containing a journal hidden for nearly a century. Perhaps most telling is what does not remain, the missing library records that Eleanor allegedly removed. The original portraits themselves, apparently destroyed by fire after Manuel's attempted burning. Eleanor's coherent testimony about what she discovered or experienced, the full context of Constance Bell's concerns that prompted her to call the police. These absences form negative spaces in the narrative, like the scratched-out eyes in the portraits, gaps where information should exist but doesn't, leaving us to fill in the blanks with speculation. Local folklore has, of course, embellished the story over decades. Some versions claim that Eleanor scratched out the eyes in the portraits herself, driven by jealousy over imagined relationships between her husband and the subjects. Others suggest that the original inhabitants of the house practiced occult rituals involving captured souls. Still others propose that the portraits were completely ordinary, and that the Martinez family's tragedy was simply the result of carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace, causing hallucinations and paranoia. None of these explanations adequately account for all the documented elements of the case. The most comprehensive theory proposed by Dr. James Lawrence of the Pennsylvania Institute for Parapsychological Research in 1973 suggests what he termed a psychometric contagion, the idea that objects can retain emotional or psychological impressions that affect those who come into contact with them. In his unpublished paper on the subject, Lawrence proposed that Coulson's original experiments, whatever their actual nature, created a kind of psychological charge in the portraits, which then influenced subsequent owners to continue the pattern. Lawrence, who interviewed the still living Dr. Simmons for his research, noted that she described feeling a strong aversion to looking directly at the journal after reading its contents, and that she avoided reflective surfaces for several months afterward. This pattern of behavioral change, specifically involving aversion to reflective surfaces and images, appears consistently throughout the case, from Coulson's original paranoia to Eleanor's hospital behaviors to Richard Graves's final days. In 1975, the Lancaster Historical Society briefly exhibited the brass plaques as part of a larger display on Victorian photography. A visitor to the exhibition, who identified herself only as Margaret, claimed to recognize one of the dates, April 19, 1873, as the date her great-grandfather had taken his own life after working as an assistant to a photographer in Lancaster. The Society's attempts to follow up on this potential connection were unsuccessful, as the woman provided no contact information. The last documented reference to the case in official records comes from 1969, when a fire inspector named Thomas Reynolds, who had been part of the team that investigated the Martinez house fire 11 years earlier, requested access to the case files. According to the department's visitor log, Reynolds spent 4 hours reviewing the materials. He then submitted a request to have the files sealed, citing potentially harmful content. The request was denied due to lack of justification. Reynolds retired from the fire department 3 months later. In a 1977 interview for a local newspaper article about historic fires in Lancaster County, he refused to discuss the Martinez case, stating only that some things were better left undisturbed. When pressed about what he meant, Reynolds reportedly said, "There are three kinds of fires: those that destroy, those that cleanse, and those that transform." The Martinez fire was the third kind. The newspaper reporter who conducted that interview, Sarah Keller, became interested in the case and began her own investigation. Her notes, preserved in the newspaper's archives, include an intriguing detail not mentioned in other accounts. While researching property records for the Willow Creek Road address, Keller discovered that between 1873 and 1958, the house had had 14 different owners. None had stayed longer than 6 years. Most had left abruptly, selling the property at below market values. Keller attempted to trace these former residents, but found that many had moved away from Lancaster entirely. Those she did locate refused to discuss their experiences in the house. One former owner, reached by telephone in 1978, listened to Keller's questions in silence before asking, "Do you own any portraits?" When Keller replied that she did, the woman said, "Get rid of them," and ended the call. Keller abandoned her research shortly afterward. Her editor later recalled that she had become unusually distracted and had taken to wearing dark glasses, even indoors. She resigned from the newspaper in early 1979, citing health concerns. Attempts to contact her for this report were unsuccessful. Is there a rational explanation for the events surrounding the Martinez family and the portraits with scratched-out eyes? Perhaps. Carbon monoxide poisoning could indeed cause hallucinations and paranoia. The presence of toxic mold in the old house might have led to similar symptoms. Eleanor's deteriorating mental state could have been the onset of schizophrenia or another psychiatric condition, influencing her husband's perceptions through a shared psychosis. Yet these explanations fail to account for the broader pattern that spans more than a century, from Jeremiah Colson's experiments in the 1870s to Richard Graves's research in the 1970s. They don't explain the consistent motif of scratched-out eyes, the persistent theme of watching and being watched, or the specific aversion to reflective surfaces that appears in multiple, unconnected individuals who encountered the portraits or researched their history. Whatever happened in that house on Willow Creek Road in the autumn of 1958 remains, like the images in the portraits themselves, partially obscured, visible only in outline, with crucial details deliberately removed from view. In his final notes on the case, Richard Graves wrote a passage that perhaps comes closest to articulating the underlying horror. We assume that seeing is a one-way process, that we look out at the world while remaining safely hidden behind our eyes. What the Martinez case suggests is more disturbing, that every act of seeing creates a connection, a channel that can be traversed in both directions. The scratched-out eyes in the portraits weren't acts of vandalism. They were desperate attempts to close doors that should never have been opened. The brass plaques with their unexplained dates remain in the Lancaster Historical Society's collection, though they are no longer on public display. The Journal of Jeremiah Colson was transferred to the State Archives in 1985 and remains accessible to researchers with appropriate credentials. Eleanor Martinez's notebook of drawings has never been located. The Willow Creek Road property, now the site of an apartment complex, gives no indication of its troubled history. And yet, a curious pattern persists. Every few years, the Lancaster County Library receives inquiries about historical photography practices, specifically about a photographer named Jeremiah Colson. The reference librarians have standing instructions to direct such inquiries to general resources on 19th century photography and to notify security if the person asking shows unusual interest in techniques involving post-mortem photography. In 1970, the last documented year with a connection to the case, a small photography studio opened in downtown Lancaster, less than a mile from where Jeremiah Colson's studio had stood a century earlier. The proprietor, who identified himself only as J.C., specialized in portrait photography, According to local business records, the studio remained open for exactly 3 years before closing abruptly. The space has remained vacant since, despite numerous attempts by the building's owner to lease it. Former clients of the studio later reported an unusual practice. After taking a portrait, the photographer would ask each subject to close their eyes for one final exposure. When asked why, he reportedly said, "So you can see what's looking back." None of the portraits from this studio have been located. As a final note to this investigation, I must acknowledge my own experience in researching this case. Over the months spent compiling these records and interviewing the few living people with connections to the events, I have found myself increasingly reluctant to look into mirrors or to maintain eye contact in conversations. Twice I have awakened at night with the certainty that someone was standing in the corner of my bedroom, watching. And yesterday, while reviewing photographs taken of the Martinez house before its demolition, I noticed something that had escaped my attention in previous viewings. In a window of the upper floor barely visible through the fire damage, what appears to be a face, or rather, a face-shaped absence, with dark scratches where the eyes should be. It is, of course, almost certainly a trick of light and shadow, a pattern created by the damaged structure and interpreted by a mind primed to see significance. Just as the entire Martinez case may simply be a series of coincidences and unrelated events, connected only in retrospect by those seeking patterns in random occurrence. Yet I find myself unable to dismiss entirely the possibility that Jeremiah Colson was right, that the human eye does retain what it witnesses, that seeing creates a connection that persists beyond death, that portraits are not mere images, but windows, and that sometimes something looks back through those windows. I have removed all portraits from my home, I have covered the mirrors, I keep the lights on at night, and still I feel watched. As Eleanor Martinez wrote in her hidden notebook, "The eyes are the windows. Breaking the glass doesn't close the window." Perhaps the most merciful thing would be to stop looking for answers, to turn away, close our eyes, and hope that whatever might be watching eventually turns its gaze elsewhere. But if you've read this far, it may already be too late. You've opened the window, and something may have seen you. For those who wish to pursue this matter further, despite my reservations, the Lancaster Historical Society maintains an archive of materials related to the case, accessible by appointment. The brass plaques, though not on display, may be viewed by researchers with appropriate credentials. I would advise against making such an appointment. Some doors, once opened, cannot be easily closed. This has been an account of the Martinez family and the portraits with scratched-out eyes, as complete and accurate as available records allow. What you choose to believe about these events is, of course, entirely up to you. Just remember, believing requires seeing, and seeing goes both ways.